monopsony. But recently, there's been a resurgence of interest in it. So, for example, if you looked at the sort of 2022 economic report of the president, you would find Chapter 5 has got the word monopsony in it, and it would have been hard to imagine that even a few years ago. So why this recent interest? Well, if we sort of do a bit of ancient history, in the 1970s, the sort of dominant view among many economists came to be that that workers had too much power. And so it became common in the 1980s to argue that we need to deregulate labour markets. You've got Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the US. And key to this was the idea that, an unfettered labour market, an unregulated labour market was a very competitive labour market, so that labour market competition alone was sufficiently strong to protect workers' interests. So if a worker was treated badly in some way by their employer, they just voted with their feet and went to some other better employer, down the street. But the outcomes that we've actually had in many countries have been rather disappointing. We've had sort of sluggish overall productivity growth. We've had, in a number of countries, decoupling of labour cost growth from productivity growth, so a falling labour share of national income. We've had sort of decoupling of average labour cost growth from median wage growth, so rising kind of wage inequality. And what that means is that our current system of labour markets and the more deregulated labour markets in the world, it just isn't really working very well for many people. So we shouldn't be at all surprised if those people start looking around for alternatives. And so we need to be thinking about what those alternatives should be. And part of the problem may well be that the labour market is not as competitive as many believed. So why do employers have market power over their workers? The key idea is basically here that if you imagine you're in a job and you're being, paid a certain salary and there's certain conditions, and to think about what would happen if your employer tried to, just a tiny bit, cut your wage or worsen your conditions. Basically, the model of a very perfectly competitive labour market would say you instantaneously walk out the door because there's another employer exactly the same down the road who hasn't done that to you, and so that threat to quit stops employers from exploiting their workers. But the reality is not like that. And why is that? Well, first of all, there are frictions. It costs people's time and money to change jobs. There are also idiosyncratic amenities from jobs. It may be that this particular employer offers you a convenient commute or an hours, or sometimes it's even just better the devil I know, that when you're trying to take a new job, you're never quite sure what it's like to work in that workplace. They may be able to say how much they're going to pay, but what it's actually going to be like, you're never quite so sure. And then finally, also, it may be the case that employers deliberately, so both of these things, frictions and idiosyncratic amenities, in some sense, we might think we can reduce them, but we don't think we're ever going to be able to eliminate them. But it may also be the case that employers actively restrict competition by collusion or other anti-competitive practices. And so the bottom line is that an employer who cuts their wage by 1 cent may find it harder to recruit and retain workers, but they will not all immediately quit. So, in the jargon of economics, the labour supply curve to the employer is not infinitely elastic. And how elastic that labour supply curve is gives us a measure of how much market power they have, just as we would measure the market power of a monopolist by the elasticity of the product demand curve they face. Now, to me, all of this seems kind of, and has seemed for a long time, common sense. But really, it hasn't had too many buyers as an idea until recently. Now, in terms of trying to think that it's sort of common sense, I think I often sort of give this example to illustrate the fact that for most people, jobs are a big deal. They're not something that you can just say, oh, well, if I lose this job, there's another one exactly the same to get for me. So this data comes from a sort of a British survey, and at the end of the survey they just ask a completely open-ended question about what's the most important thing that's happened to you over the past year. And the single biggest category is like family stuff. It's like births, marriage, divorce, deaths, kind of things. But after that, The next thing is employment. It's all about got a job, lost a job, got a promotion, these kind of things. These are really big deals to each other. They're not just, and absolutely nobody says, well, I used to shop at this supermarket and now I shop at another supermarket as a major life event. But they do think that way about jobs. Of course, the third most category is nothing. So apathy rules, if only they could be bothered. Okay, so what's happened in recent years is that questions have been changing. So the question used to be, well, do employers have monopsony power over their workers? Well, there are many economists questioning that they had any. But now I think people are asking much more about how much monopsony power is there? How does it vary? What are the consequences? What should we do about it? And those are the things that I'm going to talk about it. So there's just lots and lots. I'm not going to go on. Every week I see a new paper on this, but accumulating evidence that labour markets are not perfectly competitive. We have experimental and observational studies find that the labour supply curve to individual employers is not perfectly elastic, even among workers where you think the labour market would be very competitive. So in London, people who drive for Uber would also drive typically for at least one other platform, possibly multiple ones. So you would think they have the ability, to just accept this ride from this company instead of that, from some other company according to the pay. But the studies find that actually, even in that labour market, workers do not shift wholesale or to any great extent when, for example, Uber pays a bit more relative to its competitors. And, there seems to be a consensus perhaps settling that the labour supply elasticity is around 4 or 5. I don't know if David Card talked to you. Said David Card gave you a talk, and I don't know if you talked about that or other things, but were with some variation. So that means that employers do have some potential market power, but whether they can use it depends on how wages are determined. And I think in order to understand that in a labour market like the US or the UK, much less in Sweden, we need to focus on firms to understand this. So often economists, and I think this is a big mistake, write as if wages are determined by impersonal market forces, or there's some bargaining between individual workers and firms which somehow conveys the impression that they equal, or ignores the fact that actually employers typically have many more workers than workers have employers. So employers end up more practiced in the sort of art of wage determination. And I think it's important to say that if we don't have sort of countervailing power in the form of trade unions, it's basically firms have the greatest say in wage determination. We need to focus on their incentives, and their incentive is to pay workers below the competitive wage, below the value of what they produce. But of course, they don't set wages completely in a vacuum. They're going to be often institutional restrictions, minimum wages or collective bargaining, or other sort of restrictions and laws that might constrain them. They are to some degree competing for workers with other firms, so they're not literal monopolists, the only possible employer. But that competition is limited because labour mobility is limited because of the frictions and the idiosyncrasies. So why should economists care about any of this? Well, first of all, it implies that the fact that wages end up lower than the competitive wage, that's first of all typically going to be bad for inequality. And it's also going to be inefficient because it impedes the allocation of workers to the most productive uses. So for those two classic economist reasons, efficiency and equity, this is something that we need to worry about. Now, monopsony can sort of shed light on, new light on lots of old questions. For example, classic example would be the employment effect of the minimum wage. So if there's monopsony, then it isn't inevitable that a minimum wage destroys jobs. New perspective on the gender pay gap, that the women's labour market is less competitive, perhaps often because the constraints of caring within the household division of labour mean that the choice of employers is more limited and hence less competitive for women. About the impact of immigration, we see in countries like the UK, many employers trying to use immigration rules in order to sort of give them a sort of dedicated ring-fenced uncompetitive supply of labour, and so on. But I think this is, monopsony is not just of interest to academics, but also to practitioners, because it means that we need to intervene to ensure an appropriate balance of power between workers and employers. So I'm going to talk about different strategies we might take to do something about monopsony power. I'm going to talk about direct regulation of wages. I'm going to talk about establishing countervailing power to the monopsony power of employers, e.g. through unions. I'm going to talk about more active competition policy, and I'm going to talk about regulation of labour contracts and policies to give workers more options. So I'm just going to briefly run through all of these. So minimum wage is, a classic in a country like the UK, been an incredibly important policy. Even though we have a sort of right-wing government at the moment, it has this policy to actually increase the minimum wage faster than average earnings, and to have a target by 2024, so that's only next year now, of the minimum wage to be 2/3 of median earnings. And we've been pushing the minimum wage up and up, actually without any clear job losses at all. And it's been a stunning success. So, for example, this picture here shows you, perhaps I'll just focus on the red line. So this is the fraction of workers paid below 2/3 of the median. You can see that it was sort of in the late 70s, it was pretty low. And then we had this period of deregulation of the labour market, big rise in inequality, and big rise in the fraction of workers earning with low pay. So that went from something like 15% to 22%, I think, something like that. But in the last few years, with this policy, it's actually gone back down now to the lowest it's ever been in 50 years. So this, in the UK context, has been a sort of a stunning success because it's seemed to have been able to do this without any job losses. So the unemployment rate is very low at the moment. But the minimum wage does have its limitations. It can only affect wages at the lower end of the labour market. You can't really imagine having a minimum wage that affects average earnings. And there may well be employer avoidance strategies that we're running into in the UK at the moment. So there is no minimum wage for the self-employed, so that employers start to want to classify workers as self-employed contractors rather than employees. It may be the employers are offering fewer guaranteed hours, so we see a rise in what are called zero-hours contracts, in which an employer doesn't guarantee to offer you any amount of work. They just guarantee what your hourly wage will be, and so on. So the minimum wage is very useful, but does have its limitations. Countervailing power. So this is about really bolstering trade unions or worker voice in firms. In a country like the UK at the moment, this seems kind of really hard. I'd be interested to hear people's perspectives on here. Within the UK, it's really quite different now, that many people just don't see trade unions as the solution to the problems that they have in the labour market. They just think in much more individualistic terms. But it may be possibly that it's changing a little bit at the moment, because, for example, when inflation is low, downward nominal wage rigidity is a protection against wage falls. When inflation is 10% and your employer doesn't give you a wage rise at all, that's a real wage cut of 10% in 1 year. That's huge. And suddenly workers may be thinking, well, we need to take a bit more proactive approach to protecting our living standards. And so the next topic I'll talk a little bit about is sort of more active competition policy. So often competition laws treat labour markets and product markets symmetrically in principle, but the practice does not. So in the US, this is what has been called the historic imbalance. And Eric Posner, a lawyer in Chicago, has written this book, How Antitrust Failed Workers, which is a great summary of all of this. So in the US, is committed to examining mergers for labour market, not just consumer consequences. Based, for example, on some studies that found that hospital mergers reduce wages. And actually this year, or was it last year, was the first time that a merger between two publishers was blocked on labour market competition grounds. Now, those workers, the authors, were sort of not workers in the conventional sense, but it was felt that they would, in some sense, end up with a worse deal if they didn't have different publishers to compete over, how much they get paid for the books. And there's a paper in Sweden that, for example, found by Anna Torresson, found that, when the Swedish pharmacy market was deregulated and there's more competition, that led to an increase in wages. There's also a whole strand of work, which I'm ashamed to say that I just sort of missed completely, even though I've been interested in this area for a long time. But actually, labour markets seem much more concentrated than you would think. So there just aren't as many employers there as you like. And then, there's just simply old-fashioned collusion, implicit or explicit, may be more widespread than we think. Now, of course, if you go back to Adam Smith, I never tire of giving this quote. So Adam Smith wrote about employers that they were always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination not to raise the wages of labour. And then he sort of goes on and he says, we rarely hear of the combination of masters, though frequently of those of workmen. But anyone who imagines upon this account the masters rarely combine is as ignorant of the world as of the subject. And you might think, well, that's all kind of a long time ago. But the stuff that, in recent years, some practices have come to light, which basically are simply employer collusion. So, for example, there was a case in the US, which I actually played a very small part in, very, very tiny part, which was basically about some household names, Apple, Google, Pixar, Lucasfilm, essentially had an agreement not to proactively try and recruit each other's workers. And this is in the context of a booming labour market for these sort of tech workers. And so this shows you the sort of alleged sort of web of sort of agreements between these companies in these anti-competitive active practices. And what came to light in those cases was quite shocking, I think, to many people. So, for example, Steve Jobs was trying to recruit Palm. I don't know if anyone's old enough to remember Palm pilots. They were really the thing for a while, I think. And he tried to bring Palm into this. And the CEO of Palm basically said, well, your proposal that we agree that neither company will hire the other employees, regardless of the individual's desires, and it should be said none of the work is all completely kept secret from the workers, is not only wrong, it's likely illegal, which it turned out to be the case. And then Steve Jobs suggested that, well, if you didn't agree to such an agreement, you could face lawsuits alleging infringements of Apple's many patents. And the CEO of Palm says, I'm confident, we're only using technology we're entitled to. And then sort of Steve Jobs sort of said, yeah, I can still cost you a lot of money in lawyers' fees while doing that. I love my iPhone, actually, but I don't really like this very much. So this kind of stuff was really quite shocking. And so in the US, to a lot of people, that these household names were engaging in such blatantly anti-competitive practices. Another area is in terms of regulating employment contracts. So the area of this that has attracted the most attention has been non-compete. So a non-compete clause basically restricts workers' future employment after leaving a firm. So they might say in some form you're not allowed to work for, the most extreme cases, any other employer in the industry for a certain length of time, a very possibly a very long period of time. And there's evidence that these are both quite widespread. They have a long history in terms of sort of workers who have access to sort of privileged information, commercially privileged information. It was designed to stop them transmitting that information to the competitors, but these clauses actually being applied to this sort of like fast food workers and so on, for which there's really no conceivable justification for that. And, you know, there's evidence from kind of sports and Brazilian football. Paper today looks at this for Italy. So I meant to say, put in the stuff for Italy. So there's a study of Italy which finds that these non-competes are, you know, actually more prevalent there. And in that study, you know, I think done by Tito Apereri, they sort of went along to the unions and said, well, you know, all these employment contracts have got these non-compete clauses in them. And the unions basically said, well, we've never looked at those. We just bargain about pay and conditions and things. We don't really look at the small print of labour contracts. Again, some LSE students actually I just saw this last week, have done a similar study for the UK. My prior was actually, this isn't very common in the UK. They find, again, that it's pretty common. And I think one way to see what is sort of going on in a number of different labour markets is essentially employers are trying to appropriate the human capital of workers. So non-competes are one example of that. If they stop a worker using their skills for other employers, you're basically turning what economists would call general human capital into specific human capital. And then we think it's harder for workers to get returns to specific human capital. And there are a whole load of issues around this. So, for example, if you're a gig worker, say an Uber driver, your rating is really, really important. If you've got like a 1-star rating, this is really, really costly to you. Now, who owns that rating? Is it Uber or is it the driver? You know, so if a driver starts to work for a competitor to Uber, are they allowed to take that rating with them and say, look, here's the evidence I'm a good driver, or not? At the moment, the answer is no, because it's owned by Uber. And that makes it harder for those employers to leave. So there are kind of lots of issues going on, also beginning to be issues around non-disclosure agreements. So in employment contracts, employers saying that even when you leave the firm, you're not allowed to say bad things about the employer. So there's this website, Glassdoor. You have Glassdoor here, I imagine. Do you have Glassdoor here?
It's not widely used.
Not widely used. Okay, so yeah, so Glassdoor basically allows workers to upload information about how they give basically star ratings to their employers and comments, you know, like, you know, sort of this is a lousy place to work kind of thing. And employers basically suing workers who say bad things about them on the grounds, not that they're untrue, but that they had signed a non-disclosure agreement. But obviously you might think other workers would be interested in this isn't a very good place to work. So there are sort of issues around there. And I think more generally, we should perhaps think about rethink freedom of contract. So the common approach of economists is that, you know, we use the idea that if two parties voluntarily agree a contract, whatever is in that contract, the presumption is that they both gain because they didn't have to sign that contract. But I think we should really worry about that practice because, you know, if labour economists would often, when they're trying to explain wage inequality, they would use the idea that people differ in their ability. But in much of economics, we assume that everyone is 100% fantastic at looking after their own interest and maximising their utility. And reality, that isn't the case. So I think we should be concerned about markets where sort of in some sense amateurs meet professionals, and labour markets are like this. The employer is often going to have lawyers designing these employment contracts. The worker side is not going to just going to be an amateur, not quite sure what they're signing up to. Do they have any choice? And so on and so forth. And so we need the state perhaps to intervene on the side of the weaker party. Okay, so I'll move on to the next option. So the next option is just kind of policies to give, you know, workers sort of more options. So all of these things are quite hard to regulate. If you imagine trying to sort of intervene in every sort of employer, every employment relationship, as a sort of a state actor, or it's kind of hard to sort of micromanage in that way. So one option is just, well, we're just going to try and we're going to take the view that labour markets are going to be more competitive if workers have more options, if they do find it easier if they're treated not very well to sort of walk away and find some alternative. And there are different sort of dimensions to that. So, for example, you might sort of say we want to run the labour market hot. So we want to sort of make sure that, keep unemployment is low, even if that may mean that some other outcomes don't look kind of so good. We should sort of try and ensure that there's better information about sort of job opportunities out there. So, for example, some US states have recently passed pay transparency laws, which basically require the employer, when posting a vacancy, to say what the salary range, it can be a range, it doesn't have to be one number, but say what the salary range is. When prior to that, actually, I think in the US, only about 16% of vacancies would actually say what the pay is on the vacancy ad. So some US states have said, well, that's a problem. Workers need to be able to compare employers. We should pass pay transparency laws. There's some interesting work. Zoe Cullen has done work suggesting, though, actually that may not be necessarily have the effect that you're hoping for, that actually it may be more complicated than the argument I've just given. It's sort of a bit like in the 1990s, the UK, we passed laws on pay transparency of chief executives. So there was a concern that chief executive pay was going up much faster than the average worker. So we passed a law saying companies have to say what their chief executives would be. And the idea was that in some sense the embarrassment or the shame would mean that this would limit chief executive pay. The problem was that the people who were most interested in looking at chief executive pays were other chief executives. And so one of the consequences of that was that any company which had a chief executive who found out they were a low-paid chief executive suddenly started lobbying quite aggressively for higher pay. And so I think one view is that actually that policy designed to limit executive pay actually may have had the opposite effect. But the general idea here that we should make it kind of easier to change jobs, improve information in the labour market, I think that's a good one. But we need to, I think it's good that there's sort of experimentation in these areas, but I think sometimes these things are kind of more complicated than perhaps our simple models suggest. I also think that who owns, uses information and data is increasingly important, not just in the labour market, but certainly in the labour market. So, I mean, if we think about sort of what's happened in our economy, still happening, we just have an explosion in the amount of data on everything there is out there and the ability to process that data. And that data can be used for good or bad. And we need to make sure that it is used for good. And I think there's a risk that it increases the power of employers relative to workers. For example, who owns data? I've already mentioned, portability of ratings for gig workers. But use also matters. So we need to ensure it is freely available to workers as to employers. So some of these websites that, for example, allow workers to upload ratings from, saying this is a bad employer, avoid, they also seem to allow employers for a fee to have those ratings sort of hidden. So you can see why that's a business model for that platform, but you can also see why that might not be something you regard as being terribly desirable in the labour market. So I think this is sort of a general issue about these things. Okay. So what does this mean for sort of dividing policy? I do think that some of this stuff is quite complicated. So you improve in one margin, you can make things worse in others. And so we're sort of trying to find a policy that balances the different different margins. I think the sort of natural state of affairs, if you don't intervene, is that firms have too much power relative to workers. So we do need some interventions on the side of workers. But that doesn't mean we can't go too far. That we're sort of, in sense, what we're trying to seek is an appropriate balance of power between workers and employers, and that may be complicated, but it's important that we try. So there's still, a lot of open research questions. What's the best way to measure monopsony power? How does monopsony power vary across the segments of the labour market and why? How much monopsony power do employers actually use? Where do the monopsony profits go in our economy? Is it just going into profits, or does it disappear in the form of rent-seeking behaviour as employers try to seek monopsony profits? They may just dissipate in rent-seeking behaviour. About the transmission mechanisms of shocks to wages, other ways in which firms can adjust employment. So I'll kind of just very quickly talk about some of these. How best to measure monopsony power. So people have been using sort of concentration ratios. But the sort of open questions still about how to define those. So often people would define concentration ratios as a particular, let's say, occupation in a particular place in a particular time. But there is mobility of workers across occupations, so there's a risk that if how broad or narrow should you define occupations? Another approach, I've done quite a bit of stuff on this idea, is that basically it's all about how sensitive are separation rates to wages. So that if an employer, the key idea is that if an employer pays higher wages, they find it easier to recruit and retain workers. So separations is about retention of workers. And so we're looking to see, well, if they raise wages, how much easier does their retention problem get? But also how easy is their recruitment policy. So actually, I'm giving a seminar tomorrow at the university, and I'm going to talk about some recent work on that with some co-authors. How much, monopsony power do employers use? A lot of these measures are really measuring potential monopsony power. We're beginning to see evidence that these measures actually translate into wages. So studies that link concentration measures, for example, to wage outcomes, and other measures are less tested. And so I've got some recent work coming out again with the same co-authors, which is trying to do that. So where do monopsony profits go? Well, it's often assumed that they simply end up in the pockets of employers, but they may simply be frittered away in the form of inefficiency, because monopsony makes it hard to allocate workers to the most productive use, and they also encourage a certain amount of rent-seeking behaviour by employers. And although in labour market economics we often think of wages in competitive labour markets, wages being determined by productivity, and productivity as being something sort of exogenous that's just sort of out there. Actually, it may be that it's like productivity also depends on wages. So it may be that it's more the other way around. So, for example, there's a very relatively recent paper that kind of where they have measures of individual productivity in a US firm, and they found that when the minimum wage goes up, that actually that raises productivity. So one of the reasons in that it may be that you don't see disemployment effects is simply that productivity goes up as the minimum wage goes up. There's a whole lot of stuff about transmission of shocks to wages. This is, I think, particularly relevant. Once again, we're sort of talking about the possibility of wage price spirals, which we haven't done for 40 years or so. And that's really about the transmission mechanism of shocks to wages. And then there are other issues as well about the ways in which firms sort of adjust employment. This is sort of going on the more academic kind of section, direction. So in terms of collusions, what would I say? So I say, that the relationship in employers and workers is not fundamentally one of equals. Employers naturally have some market power, and we need to take that seriously. we need to intervene to ensure an appropriate balance of power between employers and workers. There are arguments for that on both efficiency and equity grounds. Finding effective forms of intervention, not necessarily going to be easy, but that's not a reason not to try. And I'm still a lot of work to be done, and I'm optimistic because others seem to have so many ideas kind of about what to do. So every week I'm reading some imaginative new paper on some angle, and I'm sitting here thinking, oh, I wish I'd done that, or I wish I'd thought of that. But the truth is that I hadn't. In spite of that, I'm optimistic about the future because I look at all the work that's been done now, and I think it's fantastic. So thank you very much. I'll just stop there.
Many thanks for this insightful presentation. We just have a quick break. We have coffee and buns out there. But first, just one question.
Yeah.
When you say that the labor supply elasticity is 4 to 5, converging to that, what does it mean in terms of productivity related to wages, so for people to understand the magnitudes?
So that's a good question. So if you take the standard formula, that would translate a labour supply elasticity of 4 would mean that workers are paid 80% of their marginal products. So that, you would think they're sort of 20% below the competitive wage. So that would say you'd be looking to being able to increase wages by that kind of order of magnitude. Now that's sort of, if you look at, say, I gave the example of the UK minimum wage and the evidence that a minimum wage, a minimum wage worker is probably benefited by about sort of 15%. From the minimum wage in the UK. If you look at estimates of union wage markups, they're often in that kind of ballpark, really. So, but I think it's those kind of magnitudes that you're talking about. But there are some people, I should say, who've argued the labour market is even less competitive than that. So I think there's some people, because some of the estimates of how much market power employers have are very, very high. And, so I think if you read, for example, the work by Eric Posner and Suresh Naidu, they're sort of saying workers are only getting something like 25% of their marginal products. Okay. I sort of feel that might be a bit extreme.
But if we were going closer to the market perfection model, would it be that the wage share would automatically increase then?
Well, that depends really on where you think the monopsony profits are sort of going. So if you thought they're all, going on to the profit sides of the national accounts, then yes, it would say that you would expect to have if you made the labour market perfectly competitive, you have a much higher labour share. But it may be the case that you just get all those monopsony profits just get frittered away in the form of inefficient entry. Because you get sort of low productivity, too many low productivity firms in industries, and so it just actually doesn't really show up in the labour share. What it shows up is in lower productivity than it should be, and possibly lower productivity growth as well.
Yeah. Can you also just elaborate a bit on the efficiency gains? You're talking about the mismatch between allocation of labor.
Yeah.
Are there any more dimensions in terms of productivity when you're thinking about monopsony?
I mean, there are a number of. So one is the, sort of, if you like, within an industry, it means that labour finds it hard to flow towards its most productive uses. Yeah. But it also potentially has implications, for example, for the incentives of workers to acquire skills and human capital. Because if they're not getting the full return on their marginal product, then they're not, they're not really getting a full return to human capital, and so that may reduce investments from that side of things.
Okay. And in terms of wages going to productivity instead of the opposite, that's a strong tradition in Sweden to think about that in the ren Meidner model about wages pushing productivity. And Daron Acemoglu is going in that direction for a long time. Do you have any ideas about research on this, or have you seen any new research studying this correlation and not the other way?
Yes, so you're right. I mean, it's a sort of an old idea, and there are very few ideas that are really that new, basically. But what we do have, I think, are in the past it was often a sort of more of a theoretical idea than we actually had evidence for it. But for example, that one paper that I talked about is pretty convincing, actually. That when you have an exogenous increase in wages through the minimum wage, that this led to increases in productivity of the affected workers. Now that's just one sector. I don't know if you can generalize that, more broadly, but I think that is evidence that at least in one labour market that happens.
Okay. Do you include efficiency wages in that domain too, or is that another topic?
I think of efficiency wages as, sometimes people say, well, it's monopsony or efficiency wages, and I think they're just very, very different. I think they're different ideas, so they're not necessarily competing with each other, and in fact they may even be complementary to each other. So efficiency wages is essentially the idea that if you pay higher wages, your workers become more productive in some way. And that's just a completely different idea from the monopsony idea that the labour supply curve to the firm is not perfectly elastic. So I don't see those being at all sort of in competition with each other. And I think efficiency wages are is a good idea. I think efficiency wages, I would disagree a bit where efficiency wages have traditionally been used. They've traditionally been used to argue that wages will end up above the competitive level, rather than above the market clearing level, rather than whereas monopsony is saying the below. But I think in practice, if you sort of combine efficiency wages and monopsony in one model, you basically get all the monopsony features out, but with a sort of extra twist from efficiency wages.
Thank you very much. We have a coffee outside for 10 minutes and some buns, and we will return for the discussion with Fredrik and Agneta. So we'll be back in 3 o'clock. Thanks. The possibility to say a few words about Alan's presentation and about Monopsoni research in general.
Okay,
please.
Thanks a lot. So first of all, thanks for a very interesting talk. There are so many things I would, like to discuss more and think more about. And my perspective is that I do macroeconomic research, and I also have a background in the trade union sector as an economist. So I want to think a bit about some of the stuff you talked about, but in a context of a labor market like the Swedish one or the Nordic ones, or maybe some Central European ones, where you have collective wage bargaining and some centralization in the sense that you bargain across firms. And try to think about how to use some of your concepts in this kind of labor market, which is also, to me, this is a lot of research inspiration to think about your presentation and what I want to do. So for example, you make the distinction between potential monopsony power and used monopsony power, which I think is very interesting, that I haven't really thought about. And it got me thinking about using concentration ratios as a measure of monopsony. So concentration basically is, right, you have a given labor market with 1,000 workers maybe, and either they work at, say, 1,000 different firms or at 3 different firms. So these two labor markets are going to be very different in concentration. So the one with 3 firms is highly concentrated. The one with 1,000 firms is not concentrated. And concentration is used as a measure of monopsony. And in a kind of labor market as the Swedish one, more concentrated labor markets would, at least in theory, facilitate raising the unionization rate and the coverage of collective bargaining agreements. Because you have the workers are concentrated at fewer firms, so they are easier to unionize. And with fewer firms in the market, the relevant firms are easier to cover with a collective bargaining agreement. So here you could really have the difference between potential and used monopsony power, right? You could have a lot of potential monopsony power for the firms in a concentrated labor market, but perhaps the used monopsony power is not so big because they face maybe strong unions. And you can even maybe have a negative correlation. I don't know, in some part of the state space, you have, for some reason, the labor market becomes more concentrated, and that, after some adjustment period, gives you stronger unions or more collective bargaining coverage and less used monopsony power. Whether this is the case is, of course, an empirical question, and one that I think we could study in Sweden. I think it's a difficult question to study because I think it's endogenous too. So strong unions and a high collective bargaining coverage could make labor markets more concentrated. They impose entry barriers for new firms. They price out the low productive firms. So you need some, exogenous variation in concentration rates, or it's a good case to use macro models as well. But yeah, I'm super interested in hearing if you have any thoughts on this topic and how to think about that. And also, I was thinking about markdowns as, used monopsony power in this kind of labor market. So, one common feature for collective bargaining is that, similar workers should have similar wages across firms. And you also have pattern bargaining in Sweden and in other countries where so märket, right? So where unions and employer federations in the exporting sector agree on essentially like the aggregate labor cost growth for the whole economy. And there's definitely room for local negotiations around, in both these features, around what is agreed upon centrally. But essentially we hold down wages for high productive workers or at high productive firms, and we push up wages for low productive workers or at low productive firms. So measuring markdown, you can do that, but it's difficult to interpret the findings. So whether it's a consequence of monopsony or of collective bargaining, and yeah, so these are preliminary thoughts, but I'm very curious to hear what you think about it. Do I have?
Yeah, continue if you want.
Okay, I'll just say one more thing then, which is maybe not specifically about monopsony, but about firms' incentives in wage determination, which you point out that we need to think more about. And I really agree. I think that's super interesting. And looking at the data, collective bargaining is actually quite common. So in half of the OECD countries, over half of the workforce has some kind of collective bargaining coverage or contract. They don't necessarily regulate wages, these contracts, but at the very least, I guess they regulate some important part of the labor contract, and in many cases, some part of the labor cost, and in some cases, the actual wage. And it gets me thinking, why do so many firms agree to have collective bargaining? And for sure, part of the story is that these firms are simply forced to have it. But I just imagine that that's not the full story. I think there is some room for voluntarism or firms benefiting from collective agreements. So, I mean, like I mentioned before, you put entry barriers to the market, right? So it's more difficult for new firms to enter. Or you have stable and foreseeable conditions for your labor cost or for other aspects of your labor input, for example. And I think that in this crowd, those are not new insights. But in our academic field of economics, that is not at all how we typically think about it. So I think we have much more to do there as well in terms of modeling or thinking of how, firms' incentives basically, and how to model that. I'll be very curious to hear any thoughts you have on that.
Right, well, thank you very much for those, very interesting ideas. I did say at the end of my talk, there was the young people who had all the interesting ideas. So don't look to me. So I think, yes, so your idea that concentration may not be so bad because it facilitates unionisation, I think that's a very kind of interesting idea, because it's certainly true. I think one of the big challenges for unions in, a country like the UK in the private sector is that, increasingly the economy is not made up of these giant factories, manufacturing factories, where it was easy to organise workers. If you organise one factory, you'd organise the big chunk of the industry. It's sort of lots of tiny little shops and restaurants with, very high turnover of workers. So it's sort of very challenging. I do think that, I think the relationship between the sort of collective bargaining institutions in the Nordic countries and monopsony power is interesting because, what you're saying is concentration may not be so bad on the worker side, but I think there are also some risks on the other side because when you basically have employers talking to each other much more. The employer confederations are more powerful. And so they're obviously going to sit down and talk about what they want to pay their workers collectively in a way that is potentially veering into collusive activity. Now, of course, so it's really important that you've got the offsetting, countervailing power on the other side, not to enable them to, exercise that. But if you just had very powerful employer confederations and the union side was weak, that would be a very monopsonistic labour market. So I think it's interesting that it's often, quite complicated, the relationships between some of these things, and there are lots of different moving parts and things going on. The way things might appear at one stage in one way may not be the only way. I think the second point is kind of very interesting. One way of thinking about sort of a more centralised collective bargaining system that sets a common price to sort of each sort of labour across the economy is not that that's a deviation from a perfectly competitive labour market. It's actually mimicking a perfectly competitive labour market. And, so it's actually a way of improving things. And as you've said, my impression has always been a little bit that, the Nordic country, these are small open economies. So basically, sort of some of the, unions in export sectors, they sort of know that if they push things a bit too much, there's a risk that those activity is going to go elsewhere. And so that sort of has been part of the reason that it's sort of worked here. And then I think the final point on firms' incentives to agree to collective bargaining or other forms of worker voice, I think actually Monopsoni tells you why they might sometimes want to do that. Because when you're first considering being hired by somebody, your employer is incredibly nice to you, and they promise you lots of things and say how much they love you and all of this and so on, how they're going to treat you well and so on. And they know that because when you haven't actually gone to work for them, you've got more of a choice than when you're there and you're stuck. Ex post, you're a bit more stuck, and that makes you more vulnerable to being taken advantage of being exploited. So in some sense, employers sometimes will want to have a device which promises when you're considering working for them, we're not going to treat you badly. Not now, not ever. And those kind of institutions may be one way in which you do that. Perhaps can go too far. I don't think there are many British employers queuing up to recognise trade unions, though. So, I don't know. That maybe the context here is a bit different. But thank you very much for that. It's very interesting.
Thank you, both of you. Fredrik, your turn.
Thank you. So I'm going to get to questions, but I thought first, I'm really excited that you're here. I'm glad you made the trip, and I'm very impressed that you picked the best week for many, many months to come here. It's beautiful outside, and we're in this basement. I worked as an economist at the Swedish trade union movement for 10 years, and I would like to start with a small reflection what Professor Manning's and many others' works, how it has made my job much easier in these 10 years. So except for, obvious things that I learned, because of monopsony power, I'm not as valuable in the labor market as I used to think I was. So that was very obvious. Another thing I learned in Monopsony in Motion is that if labor markets were efficient, people, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think you're right. If they were efficient, people wouldn't celebrate at the pub when they got a new job. And I make a point celebrating when I get a new job every decade, new job. You don't change jobs much in the union movement, I understood. But briefly then, what do unions do? In the wage perspective, which we talk about here, unions monopolize labor output through cartelization to seek to engage in collective bargaining. Is this good or bad? So 10 years ago, when talking to other policy professionals, often on the other side of the collective bargaining fence, but sometimes in academia as well, I'd say my perception in Sweden at least was the assumption that labor markets tended towards efficiency was quite widespread. At least it seemed like it when I had very difficult discussions about this with people. And when unions, if labor markets were efficient and unions raised wages, they would raise them above the competitive rates, and that would be a social bad. But what empirical monopsony research has showed is that labor markets aren't efficient, so unions can actually be somewhat rational in economic modeling. Is this sort of right?
Yes, no, I think that's right, and I think it's been important in sort of these debates, public debates, and so on, to to have some counterweight to the idea that labour markets are perfectly competitive. Just to give another example, one reason I think American labour economists have been open to it is often a lot of them were acting as sort of expert witnesses in court cases about gender discrimination. In basically employers paying women less than men, and they were coming up against the argument, well, this is impossible because labour markets are perfectly competitive, and so no matter what the data looks like, it's just logically impossible that this represents discrimination. And so they found it useful to then have this monopsony argument in their back pocket to be able to play this card, and that argument then has lost its force. So it sounds a little bit like what you're saying.
I hope it made sense somewhat. But what it essentially does is that I think the basic idea of the trade union, the rationale, the basic tenet that we do this is because employers have wage setting power. And now that there is, I guess, somewhat of a consensus in economics, I don't know, I believe at least that David Card's Nobel Prize sort of legitimized this idea to a high degree. So I guess this is a comment on how research is disseminated. And I would say too, like the most obvious thing that you notice when you, as a policy professional, you quote heavy institutions like the OECD, for example. And the fact that they write about these things has been an important channel to gain a wider acceptance that unions aren't this gravel in the machinery that we have been viewed for a long time. And I think the fact that Swedish unions have been viewed this way in Sweden maybe has a lot to do with insider-outsider dilemma. So now to my question. So first, could you comment a little bit on, is the Lindbeck-Snowden insider-outsider dilemma still something relevant for us to look for? The second question I have, monopsony theory is built really heavily on the concept of exit. Like you get your bargaining power by having a lot of outside options, threatening or exercising them, like I'm going to quit or not. Having worked in Swedish union organizations and taken a big interest in what the actual unions, the ombudsmen who go out to the work sites do, they don't really think about that. You represent the members in their current workplace often, and then it's a voice issue. Yeah. So what is the role of voice in all of this? How do we think about that in the theoretic models, and how can we do research on this? And finally, I would like you to perhaps reflect a little bit on, I asked you this before, but going from somewhat heterodox, using very orthodox economic methods, yes, but so did Joan Robinson, I think, but she was still considered quite heterodox. How, except that you have to go out and talk about monopsony a lot more often now. What is your feeling about this? And I actually have a final one, which is about policy in the United Kingdom. What do you make of the fair pay agreements proposals that Labour is talking about right now? Because, I mean, one thing that the Swedish union movement doesn't like are legislated minimum wages. The reason is that, well, A, you hand over wage setting to someone who you might not trust in the next election. And second, it reduces perhaps the incentive to join a union and get your wage increase, what we would say the proper way. So, thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Those are very interesting questions and so on. I mean, if I have to think about the sort of Lindbeck-Snow insider-outsider thing, I interpret that in very broad terms as sort of saying that inside workers can pursue their own sectional interests at the expense of some others. What I take away from that is really sort of what I said, is that we're trying to seek, an appropriate balance of power. So yes, I think that, trade unions can sometimes pursue sectional interests, which are not necessarily in the wider interest. They're no better or worse than any other group in society in having that sort of temptation. And so what we're trying to do is to sort of find what we think of as, an appropriate balance of power. Now, I think my impression always was Asa Lindbeck tended to think they had too much power. So I'm not quite sure I would necessarily agree with his particular view on that. But in some sense, I do think of it as being sort of it's about seeking an appropriate balance of power, and you can go too far. I mean, what you said about sort of exit and voice, I mean, I think, yes, I mean, I wish I'd kind of used those words in a way. So I think that, exit is important. Being able to walk away and have a good alternative, that's important. But at the same time, we have to be realistic. That's always going to be costly. It's always going to be disruptive and so on. And so having a voice, and not just a voice, but some way of actually that voice being effective as a way of sort of remedying things is important as well. So again, I would see those as sort of complements to each other rather than substitutes to each other. In terms of sort of heterodox, orthodox, I mean, I've never been really that bothered about the sort of I mean, Joan Robinson, you're right, when she did Monopsony, it's very orthodox, but she disowned that. She ended up, when she became more heterodox, it was disowning all of this. She just, didn't kind of like it at all. And so I've never been that bothered about kind of the labels. I mean, I think I'm the voice of reason and moderation, and I don't know whether that's obviously should be orthodoxy, shouldn't it? So and so on. And then I think in terms of the UK, so fair pay agreements, I think I'm not that close actually to what the Labour Party is sort of thinking, but I think there are sort of a number of ideas around the fact that, for example, the minimum wage has been very successful, but there are limits to how high it can go, and we may be getting close to those limits. But there are, for example, employers who can afford to pay more than higher wage. So they're looking to some kind of more sort of voluntary minimum wages in terms of these sort of fair pay kind of agreements, or the living wage. We have this sort of living wage movements and so on. And in doing that, they're also trying to give some advantage to trade unions, private sector unionism, which is sort of very problematic. So it's sort of trying to think about having the reach of, because if you think about what policy levers do we have in the UK to influence pay determination at the median, there's really very, very, very little. And so it's sort of trying to come up with ways of doing that, I think.
Yeah. Would you say it could be a way to get employers in the UK to cartelize? Because I would think that's a brilliant idea.
Well, there's certainly people within the UK who are very keen on sort of introducing sectoral collective bargaining, sort of Swedish, sort of in the direction of Sweden, if not exactly that. I'm not quite sure whether they're going. That's so far away from where we are sort of now. I mean, I think there's always been a debate within the Labour Party about whether you want to sort of grow the union movement from the base up or impose it from the top down, in the term of saying, well, you have to have sectoral collective bargaining. And, I think the balance of opinion has normally been we want to make it easier to organise at the grassroots level and from that build it up. But that almost, at least initially, probably means you're talking more about individual firm bargaining than you are sectoral collective bargaining.
Yeah.
Many thanks for this. Staffan, can you start walking around? There's a question from the audience, but first one question from me. Let's say it like this. Is it a study from Norway says that a growing union density in Norwegian firms leads to higher productivity? In Alex Bryson, your colleague. Yeah. Does it mean that we should interpret this as reduced monopsony power also leads to higher productivity in this sense, because you get a stronger voice and you got common interest in the development of the firms?
I mean, I tend to think monopsony explains everything, but so I would say yes. But there may be other people who would say there are other possible explanations.
Okay, you never know. Okay. Does anyone have any question? Please say who you are. And
hi, my name is Roger Mortvik. I'm a consultant. I have a question following up to Agneta's question. It's about if monopsony companies are less interested in sectoral agreements, would you say that they would be more interested in more kind of a closed shop agreements to avoid competition among workers at the same company?
I mean, I think that, employers really don't like competing for workers with each other. So in some sense, I'm not sure if this is quite your question, they're looking for ways to monopsonize labour markets. And often they don't think that, they think sort of worrying about recruitment and retention of workers is a major pain if you run a company. So anything they can do to reduce that is a plus from their point of view. So I can remember I was a bit involved in trying to design the work permit system post-Brexit. And I can remember this meeting with a group of employers, and they're basically, the government has said free movement is going to end. and the employers are basically arguing for something close to free movement afterwards. And so one of the employers says, well, if you don't give us something like free movement, we'll have to compete with each other for workers. And everyone round the table, the employers around the table go, yeah, that would be an absolutely terrible, terrible thing. So I think they are always kind of looking. I'm not quite sure if was that your question? Not really. So I think that employers also, in terms of sort of collective agreements, I mean, I find it hard to answer because we don't really have, collective agreements in the private sector. So I don't see. But for example, if you think of the minimum wage, you find big companies being quite strongly in favour of the minimum wage, but they tend to be the higher wage companies within a sector, and they tend to be in favour of a minimum wage that's a bit below what they're currently paying, but above what their competitors are paying. So it's not the case that all employers always are sort of hostile to regulation, but it's always generally motivated by actual or perceived self-interest on their part that may or may not be in the wider, societal interest.
Thanks. There's a question from the viewers here, but now it disappeared. Okay, any other question from here, inside here?
I'm Rickard Eriksson, and I'm an analyst at the Swedish Bankers Association. And I'm thinking about this Monopsoni profits. You said you had different ideas of where they went, but how about consumers? I mean, if you have say Volvo has monopsony power in Gothenburg for car workers, but so do maybe other car manufacturers in different parts of the world, and they all compete on the market. Why don't you mention it? Is this something that I'm missing, or?
You're right. I haven't said about. I've just talked about employers and workers, and I haven't said anything about the customers of the employers, and they're potentially affected by all of this. So I think I also think I haven't talked really about the interactions between labour market power and product market power, and those interactions are also quite important. I think that sometimes it's certainly in sort of competition policy, there's been there's been too much emphasis on consumer welfare. So, for example, if you had two firms that are merging, it used to be, it historically was a defence under the competition law to say, well, after we merge, we're going to actually we're going to have lower costs, and so we're going to actually have lower prices for the consumers. So the consumers will be beneficiary. But those lower costs may actually come from monopsonising the labour market and driving down wages. So it's one thing if those are efficiency gains. It's another thing if they basically come from at the expense of workers. So I think it is that sort of, again, it's that sort of balance. And you're right to say that when I've been talking about the balance of power between employers and workers. And really, you've also got the consumers as a third leg in there as well.
Thanks. Any more questions from here? No? Then I take a question from the streaming. Sorry.
My name is Hans. In your book, I think on page 5.
Oh my goodness!
I read it carefully. Great book.
Yeah.
You state that one of your assumptions is that employers will set the wages, but in an environment where there's a high level of unionization, monopsony is not as relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember exactly what I wrote. I mean, what I meant by that was that in the absence of collective bargaining, the right way to think about things is that firms are going to set wages and they're going to have some market power, and because they have some market power, we would then expect them to use it. But it goes back to the point that, for example, Agneta raised as well, that there's a difference between having the power and actually using it. And it may well be that, collective bargaining and unionisation, it doesn't get rid of the market power that employers have, but it limits the use of it.
Thanks. This is a question from Per Lindberg. He says, how is this field of research applicable to other markets that shares the same features of frictions and idiosyncrasies? For example, rental markets where landlords may have monopsony power over tenants for similar reasons.
I mean, I think that's sort of very, it's potentially very relevant. I mean, changing, for the same kind of reasons that, there are big frictions to changing where you live. There are often idiosyncratic amenities to, where you live. And that means that, potentially you have this sort of asymmetry between tenants and landlord. I mean, I think it depends a bit about how organised the landlords are. I think different countries are different in this respect. So, for example, in the UK, most landlords are actually amateurs. They're just people who own one other or two other properties. And, they're not really, they're not like an employer employing kind of many, many workers. But at the same time, I think there are other countries where you have sort of much more in the way of professional, big-scale landlords. And there you would, I think it's, some of the issues are the same. I don't necessarily mean that you should think that the policy remedies are exactly the same. So, for example, if one thought of the analogy between minimum wages and rent control, I think the evaluations of minimum wage policies look much more positive than the evaluations of rent control. That may, it may not be that, it may be that the right approach to dealing with this sort of monopsony power in the sort of housing market is not the analogous, is not the minimum wage, whereas in the labour market it is in part.
Okay, thanks. One more from the streaming. I want to follow up on something you'd mentioned regarding those working for platforms. How do you see the role of monopsony power operating today in app-based work, for example, Uber, Bolt, etc.?
Well, I think in some sense there's partly a sort of a regulatory kind of issue that they are certainly those platforms, certainly in the UK and the US, their preferred form of organisation is that the gig workers are essentially independent contractors. I mean, they're called different things in different countries, but effectively they're self-employed because the self-employed are then not subject to, for example, minimum wages and so on. So there's partly a sort of a regulatory kind of issue there. There's also, a debate about how competitive these labour markets are. I mean, one view was that, if you're driving for Uber and you're driving for Bolt, you literally have two potential employers, in front of you at any moment. And so it's easy to switch between employers in a way that it just really isn't for most traditional workers. And so those labour markets would end up very competitive. But having said that, the people who've actually studied those labour markets find that workers' actual behaviour doesn't suggest that they're actually very competitive. They actually suggest that those employers have got quite a lot of market power over their workers.
Can I follow up with a follow-up question or comment? Sort of, it's not particularly on that, but on the gig workers, and you mentioned that who owns and uses the data that we create becomes increasingly important in the labor market, and I think that is an interesting point that I haven't thought about really. I mean, that discussion exists a bit in Sweden, not so much, but relating to consumers, like Facebook owns my data as a consumer of their services and they use it. But in the labor market, I haven't seen that discussion basically at all. In some sense, the data is not necessarily new. I mean, there's always been a lot of data on my performance or your performance as a worker, but it's been in the head of the manager or, in the perception of the coworker. But now it's becoming documented and transferable. And I think for the unions, this is a potential task on their, agenda. Maybe 10 or 20 years down the road, much more data in more sectors for more professions is going to be documented and transferable, and maybe it's going to be part of, what should be negotiated in the collective contracts, or something for unions to actually think about down the road. Like, there's a big discussion on AI and technology and stuff like that, but maybe this is also one of the future avenues to think about what policies to have or how to regulate that. And I don't know if you have any more examples of input you can give, good or bad policies you've seen. Or...
Well, I think the general point, I agree with that. So in some sense, this information is out there more generally now and potentially usable, and it's about making sure that data is used for good and not bad, basically. And I think it is about perhaps thinking about more imaginative ways in which it can be used and protected. I think I gave the example of non-competes in Italy being very prevalent in a context of union agreements there. And basically the unions had never thought to really negotiate on what were these clauses in these employment contracts. And so it's sort of not being too wedded to the traditional sort of bread and butter pay conditions, whatever else the unions do, but to remain ahead of the curve rather than behind it, basically. So I think, so thinking in that way, I think is kind of important. But I would say it's kind of complicated, so I'm not quite sure exactly what that means in practice, but I do think thinking about it is important.
Fredrik?
Yeah, so I promised that I would try to reflect as much on Alan, but I need to mention my own research here. But we've done a case study on a Swedish company that has a really constructive relationship with their employer. It's in the mining industry, and they bargain about this all the time. And they lean on GDPR a lot. So one thing that they tend to say is, so you're going to collect data. What data are you collecting? What are you going to use it for? And how often will you, what time interval will you cull or remove this data? And the sole purpose is that the unions recognize that data hoarding for whatever use in the future is probably going to be bad for their members. So within the GDPR framework, you can do bargaining around this kind of stuff. But I want to follow up on something that you mentioned before. It's kind of related to my research as well. But I find in Sweden that for blue-collar workers, I did one of those concentration wage studies. I found that white-collar workers, we see the expected thing, decreased concentration, higher wages when we're correct. But for the blue-collar side, it's the other way around. It seems that larger employers with lower concentration seem to pay slightly better. Trying to find out why, one thing that I run into is fisherization of labor markets or outsourcing. And I think you mentioned it in your slide, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the role of outsourcing in this, because outsourcing should mean that there are more firms, but they seem to pay less.
Yeah. I'm not sure, I know I shouldn't admit this, but I'm not sure I know that much about outsourcing or have that much view. I mean, I think it's clearly that employers have been using it. A question I think I have is that really, whether that's really, although I do think monopsony explains everything, whether that's really due to monopsony power. So, like a fair amount in the UK context has been basically outsourcing to a company, which then, shifts these people from being employees to being independent contractors. And so there's this outsourcing has been essentially regulatory arbitrage, that they're finding ways of essentially, I always get confused about whether evasion or avoidance is legal. Avoidance is legal. Is that right? I think avoidance is legal. So they're trying to avoid labour market regulations, and these are ways in which they sort of they do that. Whether that's about making the labour market less competitive, I'm not so. I'm not sure. I've really thought about that, but that's a good question.
Thanks. Any more question? No. Then I finish with the last question. And that is, in 10 to 15 years, where do you think the monopsony lens of labor markets has taken us in terms of research and policy? And give us some advice. Where should we look from a Swedish perspective?
Are we looking 10 to 15 years back or forward?
Forward.
Forward.
Where
oh
are
my
we?
Goodness. Well, I think I mean, I've sort of been, I've been an economist for a long time, so I've seen a lot of ideas come and go. So I guess whenever I see, monopsony has, in some sense, over the last few years, been coming, and I guess the question is, is it just going to be a fad that comes and goes, or is there something more sort of fundamental there? I mean, I tend to think there's something more fundamental there, because I think the basic idea is just common sense that people think of jobs as a big deal, and that fact gives employers some market power over that. In fact, when I explain this to my mum, she says you get paid for coming to that conclusion. So that's why I think it's sort of a fundamental kind of thing. So I think in some sense it's here to stay. And an analogy in academic terms would be the idea of imperfect competition in product markets is, commonly accepted that that's the right way to think about things. People say, well, some markets there's more competitive than others, but no one really disagrees that this is the right way to think about things. So where will we be in terms of, policies? I mean, I think I remain sort of optimistic that we will be finding a sort of a better way in which our economic system, has growth, and that growth is widely shared, and that's sort of something that we've lost. And if we don't recover it, we're not, we shouldn't be that surprised if people start looking around for alternatives, which, it's easy to diagnose problems, but it's much harder to come up with effective solutions.
Thanks. And with this answer, we finish this seminar. Very much thank you for all of you, especially Alan.
Thank you.
This is a small present from us.
All right, thank you very much.
Read it on the back home. Oh, to Germany first.
For Germany, I'll read it. Listen. Can I open it now?
Sure. Inetta.
Daniel. Bra.
Hi, sorry, I'm just... Oh, there we are. That looks nice.
Ja, just det. Ja, kul. Ja, så roligt att höra här.
Yeah.